But yeah, so I'm happy to see if sharing works. Great. I'm happy to give this talk. And the challenge for me is more that I think about these things too much. So I see Ellen nodding around. So this is my attempt to sort of pack it into like one talk. So how do you communicate, the love of your life in like 15 slides, 20 slides? So I think this is the right level and depth, and I love your feedback after, because this would be a fun sort of lecture to develop more. And yeah, so my subtitle here is The Unloved Stepchild of Causal Inference. And from what Ellen's told me, you guys are learning about research and how to do research and stuff like this. And so I don't know how much exposure you've had to all the contemporary theories, but causal inference is like the real big thing in the social sciences right now, and has been for probably a few decades at least. And that's what, basically papers that make, causal arguments or explanatory arguments are usually seen as more valuable than arguments that are doing mere measurement. And I sent you a classic paper by John Gehring called Mere Description. That one is it's a tough one to read. There's a lot in there. Every time I read it, I discover something new. So if you didn't get all of that, don't freak out. That was sort of the challenge reading part of it. But if you're thinking about graduate school, I mean, it's a really great one to digest because he has a lot of really good theory. But yeah, I think measurement is really, really important. And before we can get to explanation, we have to talk about measurement. So this is my kind of attempt to pack all this together. Oops. All right. So why measurement? I'm going to give kind of high level like motivation for like why we do this. So I would say that measurement is actually key to science. And it's easier, I think, in some ways to see this in the natural sciences, where you get sort of a new way of measuring things like a telescope. And all of a sudden you have this whole branch, like this whole new field develops, right? You invent electron scanning microscopes, and then you have like new fields of like microbiology kind of came out of nowhere. And really, I mean, I think that if you were to talk to people and just ask them what science is, a lot of them would talk about measurement, right? That scientists make very exact, precise measurements. Sometimes, more precise than they should be, but and I'd say that that's just as true for social science. Measurement is core to what we do, and our ability to measure things actually, I think, determines our rate of advance. Now, we can also make theoretical advances, and those are certainly important. But I would say that without being able to improve our ability to measure things, we have a really tough time actually making progress in science. And measurement is not easy. That's what we'll sort of get into, because we have to kind of agree about what it is we want to measure, and we disagree about that. And we also need to talk about how we're going to measure it. Like if we agree that what it is we want to measure, we still have to agree on how we're going to decide to measure that. So I'm going to give some practical tips in this talk, but just to be clear, there's a lot of different perspectives and views, and this is sort of more of an invitation to learn than it is, a sort of final dictum. And I should say too, I mean, I'm happy to be interrupted. You can raise your hands with the little Zoom thingies, or just, unmute and interrupt. That's totally fine. I'll do my best to check these things. Ellen, feel free to interrupt me if someone has a question too, so you don't need to wait to ask questions. So what is, oops, I showed the hint, shouldn't have showed the hint. So what is, measurement in social science? Usually we're trying to measure what we call constructs. And by construct, it's sort of short for human construct, meaning this is something that human beings created or invented. And crucially, this means that a construct only exists in people's heads. And this isn't something that's entirely obvious to people initially. This is why social science is very difficult, because, and there might be times social science where we're trying to actually count physical things, maybe geography or something, the features of a landscape. Sometimes if you get into public health, you might count like body weight or some other measurable attribute of human beings, but that's not generally what we, even if we're doing that, often that's not what we directly care about. What we care about are these ideas or, conceptions of the world that human beings have, and the institutions and other sort of things they create. So the example I want to come up with here, and this is my group activity, we'll see how this works over Zoom. But we have this idea of the fast food restaurant, right? And I know because of this was originally maybe an American thing, and now with globalization, it's been inflicted on the rest of the world. So I know I've been in enough Arab countries to know that there is fast food everywhere. So I want to ask you a question: How do we measure a fast food restaurant? I mean, as a distinct category of restaurants, what is a fast food restaurant? How would you measure that? I will sit here and wait for the first non-shy person to give it a stab. تفضلوا.
تفضل. How fast they deliver food, and if they have like a construct or like a system to deliver a food in certain time with like no waiting time or something.
Okay, so that's why I had the hint. Oops. The hint is, okay, so let's back up, right? So I've been to restaurants like every once in a blue moon. I go to like a really nice restaurant and I sit down, and it has like a really expensive menu. That's why I don't go very often. And I order my food, and it's arrive within 5 minutes or 10 minutes, right? And like 2 weeks ago, I was at Yas Mall, our big mall, and I went to McDonald's, and it took them 20 minutes to give me my food, right? So what's wrong here? Like, there's this really expensive restaurant, right? That served me that food really quickly, but there are fast food restaurants I've been to that are really, really slow, right? At times. So speed doesn't necessarily, like, I feel like that fancy restaurant's not, like, I wouldn't call that a fast food restaurant. So what are some other maybe indicators for fast food?
So I maybe I have a comment on that.
Tafadhal.
Yeah, I think it's so it's about how people use the term. So I would define it based on how people use it. So meaning as used in that sense. So maybe people normally, when they say fast food, they refer to the kind of the food that is normally junk, the kind of McDonald's, KFC. I would give examples of such food. So it's the, if you want to, kind of fried, unhealthy international brands that I'm just trying to come up with how people use the terms. So I would go select, maybe do some survey to see how people use the term and what kind of first one come to their mind, and I will make some common criteria of what a fast food is, since it's a construct, and therefore the meaning has to be with use, not anything else. There is no inherent meaning beyond use.
Good. Yeah. So you're actually coming up with a measurement strategy there, right? We use an open-ended survey. I think in this situation, we don't need to go. We could do that measurement project. That'd be fun. But I think you had some really helpful indicators in there, right? You're like unhealthy. So it's not just the speed of the food, it's the quality of the inputs, right? Fast food is it's actually fast but cheap food, right? So if we wanted to measure this, it would be some combination of the speed with which the food is delivered and the amount that the restaurant is spending, right, to prepare this food. And if we thought about it further, we might think, like, as you said, Bassam, some of the techniques they use, right? Fast food is often fried, like not all the time, but often, right? And also, if we keep going, and you can debate this, of course, on your own with your friends, there are edge cases, right? There are so I'm gonna do a little US stuff, but there are restaurants in the US like Panera or Au Bon Pain, that are like fast, right, but are also healthy and don't have like the fat frying, right? Do we call those fast food, you know? So, you know, and anyway, the next, you know, we just keep going and going, and, you know, thankfully we're not, you know, nutrition researchers. But this is just a good example of how something, you know, really simple and seemingly obvious, like fast food restaurant, and Renoir fell for my trick that the obvious thing is to say, well, it's the speed with which the food is served. Like, actually, maybe not, right? It just shows you how what is a fast food restaurant is actually something that exists in people's heads. It's not something that you can point to and say, well, like a, you know, a geologist can say this is a sedimentary layer, right? It's it's something that you really have to think about. What is it that people mean when they say a fast food restaurant, right? And we may actually have trouble classifying all restaurants that way. So a fast food is actually a human construct. So this is kind of, you know, the problem with social science. This was Ellen knows my advisor, David Waldner. This is one of his favorite sayings: God gave physicists all the easy problems. So this is a picture. Can anyone guess where this picture is from?
Galaxy.
It's not. It's a star. Good. Yeah, I mean, very close. And it's the James Webb Telescope, right? Have you been hearing about the James Webb Telescope? This like new telescope that they sent out into space, and they're all proud of it. And it's returning these new pictures. And this is apparently a star that's forming, expelling gas. You know, so they're really proud of their telescope. We should all be proud of their telescope, but to be completely honest, it's a fairly simple measurement problem. Like, you just make a better mirror, right, and figure that stuff out, and then you take a picture. The star is not going to like decide one day, hey, I don't feel like expelling, you know, hot gas anymore. This was really old. It's ridiculous. I'm just going to stop. Right? They can just wait until they have a better measurement tool, and then they deploy it. And none of them are disagreeing about what a star is. Well, maybe they have some disagreement. I don't know, but you know, they all agree like that's what a star is, right? Let's take a picture of it. So in the social sciences, we not only have to do good measurement, right? And we want to do good measurement. We face issues in defining what it is we want to measure. And if we can't define that, then we don't even know if we're doing a good job or a bad job, right? Now I gave you a piece by John Gehring, and when I was writing this, I thought of this, and so I put in the slides, so I thought it was funny. But I really think this is true. And I've decided to come up with what I call the John Gehring rule. Everything important to say about measurement has been said by John Gehring, except for the John Gehring rule. And I really, as you are exploring these issues or, you know, learning about research design, I really recommend his stuff. He's written textbooks, he's written all kinds of things with a really thoughtful, reflective sort of approach to social science, and a really, really good, solid focus on measurement, indicators, how we create these things. So those are really good resources, you know, to pick up if you're either, you know, preparing for grad school, going into grad school, or just doing research. Really useful stuff. And so I first want to talk a little about his article. Okay, and he, you know, he's kind of thinking at a very high level, right? His article is not telling you exactly how to do measurement. We'll talk more about that. His article is really more how where does description fit into kind of the things that we do as social scientists. So this is, you know, causality, let's say that's the goal of social science, right? So this is what we call a causal diagram. You may have seen these before. We have two variables, X and Y. X is usually called the independent variable. Y is called the dependent variable. Y is the thing we're trying to explain. So let's say we're trying to explain, you know, are people, you know, as people get richer, are they more likely to support democracy, right? This is a longstanding hypothesis in social science. Their, you know, wealth would be the independent variable X, and democracy would be Y, the outcome. And most of the time in social science, we want to get to this level. We don't just want to describe things, right? We want to actually explain them. And we all know that, and that's good. Like that is a good goal to have, right? And a lot of you probably got into social science in some way because you're interested in a causal argument about something, about women's rights in the MENA region, about corruption, about democracy, human rights. What sustains these things? What makes them worse? So that's really good, right? And he spends a lot of time defining causality. But we have a major problem. Okay, and I'm going to introduce you to some of the notation that people use in measurement. The more quantitative side, but it's also used in qualitative stuff. So if you look at the top part of this diagram, you know, we'll do the basic thing they do with like 4-year-olds. You know, you look at 2 pictures. So what's different about the top part of the diagram? We'll do it again. What happened to X? Come on, guys, the easy question.
Became L. I don't know.
Yeah. So what happened, Bassam?
It became L. I think there was an X in this.
Yeah.
There's an L instead of the L. There's an L.
And
Sorry.
yeah, good. And it became dashed, right? And so what that means is I'm using the word, the letter L. L stands for latent. Latent means unobserved. It's not something we can observe directly. And so I colored it, I gave it a dashed line to represent that it's observed, or it's unobserved. It's not something we can see. So in this situation, you know, this is often like the situation, you know, that we find ourselves, right? Let's say, you know, your research question is, you know, do more positive attitudes about women's rights lead men to also be more, you know, respectful of women, right? So that's the outcome you're trying to measure. You can measure it as, you know, willingness to, you know, some kind of attitudinal measure about women is your outcome. You can measure that maybe fairly precisely, but then, you know, their attitudes about women or their attitudes about feminism, about women's rights, right? You would need a measure for that as well. And so we often find ourselves in a situation in which we can't get necessarily very direct measures of what we want. And so then we use indicators. And so those are the lines down at the bottom, right, are connected to indicators. So what we end up doing is we have indicators. So I have indicator for X. I probably should abbreviate that L, indicator for Y. And really what we're doing is we're seeing if there's a causal relationship between different indicators. Okay, so let's say we use indicators from survey research. We have a survey measure about their belief about, you know, women's rights, survey measure about, you know, whether or not they think, let's say, women should work outside the home. Those are indicators, okay, for concepts that we care about. And if we find a relationship between those indicators, we haven't actually found a relationship for our causal argument necessarily. We found a relationship between these indicators that we're using to measure constructs or concepts, same basic thing. And so that's what introduces, let's say, our measurement problem, okay? That in social science, we're almost always doing this. We don't have direct measures of things, right? Meaning that, you know, we can't just build a telescope and solve our problem. We have to think about what's the best measure that we can find to represent this construct or concept, because we can't see into people's minds. We can do MRIs and, you know, and stuff like that, but not really. We can't represent, you know, really understand what's going through people's heads. We need some kind of something we can measure, some kind of tangible thing that we can ask people for a response to measure a construct. So this is what measurement error essentially is that, you know, instead of doing the cause, you know, instead of being able to look directly at the thing we want to measure or study, we have to use proxies or indicators, right? Gehring has this sort of typology that he represents, and I won't go through all of this, thank God, but it's very thorough. And the point I want to make here is that description actually can be many, many things. So, you know, the first branch there is he talks about particularizing or accounts. And this is basically just, you know, you might think of like a case study, but just, Bassem kind of said this. Well, what if you just ask people what, fast food restaurants are, right? Just give an account, just share your thoughts about what this thing is. And that's totally fine, right? A lot of measurement in the social science goes the other direction, which is generalizing, meaning that we're trying to find some kind of rule to decide what indicators we use to represent a concept. Okay. And you notice, so then there's a branch between one-dimensional and multidimensional, and one-dimensional are indicators. Okay. So again, if we use a survey question to represent a concept, the thing we're trying to study, that's an indicator, right? If we have multiple indicators, right, then it's multidimensional. And oftentimes in social science, people just use a single indicator. And there's nothing really wrong with that. Often that's the best we have. We say, okay, this is our, going back to our fast food example, our best indicator is, the quality of the food inputs that restaurants use. We use that as our indicator for fast food, right? And that's the best we can do. But if we have multiple indicators, we can actually do more sophisticated things, right? Some of these, I think actually the one at the bottom is kind of the most interesting. It's called a typology, which is actually where we sort things into categories based on rules. And anyway, yeah, so there's more complicated kind of ways of doing measurement. But for this talk, at least, what we'll primarily focus on is selecting an indicator to represent a concept, because that's the real basic and kind of major task that social scientists do and that they use. And ideally, we actually want to have multiple indicators. And I'll talk about why that's actually helpful, even if it's not necessarily always done in social science. We'll do one at a time here. So now that we talked a little about what measurement is, how do you do it in a way that's really good, right? And I would say the first and really maybe most important thing here is that we want measurement to be transparent, meaning that other people both can understand how we made our decisions about what to measure, and ideally that people could replicate it, right? So let's say, another really common social science data task is like you go out and you code countries, right? A lot of people's dissertations are like different codings of countries for being more or less democratic, for coups and democratic backsliding, which we'll talk about later. When you're making those decisions about, what indicators you want to use to represent a coup or to represent democracy or to represent, elites and the decisions that they make, ideally you want to be open about, where you derive these indicators from, right? Did it come from a newspaper source? Did it come from survey research, if you have that? Did it come from other articles? So that ideally someone could go and actually redo your entire study, right? That's sort of the goal of what we call, replication. Now that may not actually be possible, right? Some of the measurement that we do can be really intense. Let's say we do focus groups, or we go to archives and it's hard to get into them, and that's totally fine, right? But to the extent possible, we want other people to be able to replicate what we do. Maybe we didn't make the right measurement choice, right? Well, we can't improve on that if we don't really understand, the reasons for why we did what we did. We also want our measurement to be grounded essentially in theory, right? We can measure things fairly well by just thinking about it, like our conversation about fast food. But often, in the social sciences, people have already thought about this quite a bit, right? And this is a big reason you do your lit review and you really think about these things, because you want that to the extent possible, you really want to have a fleshed out understanding of the concept that you're trying to measure, right? That will help you to think of indicators and to think of ways that you can measure it. And finally, and this is a somewhat more technical point that I'll get into more later, to the extent possible, if we're uncertain about measurement, which we often are, we don't know if these are the correct indicators. There may be issues in our coding, data we didn't have, cases we're unsure about. we want that uncertainty to be reflected in our analysis to the extent possible. We don't want to just say, oh, well, this was the best we could do. Malish, we'll just sort of go and finish the analysis, right? Unfortunately, that's what a lot of social scientists tend to do. And part of it is, we're human. We only have so much time to do a research study, to write a paper, and that's fine, right? But ideally, like if we have uncertainty about measurement, we want to reflect that in our analysis. We want to be open about that, because that will help people know, right? Like what are the limitations of our analysis, and to the extent that we can even use different measures to try to say, okay, well, I'm not so sure about this one. Let's try this one. What's called triangulation using multiple sources of information. We want to try to do that too. So falsifiability, I probably shouldn't have used that word. It's a big word, but basically means, testing things, right? Determining if they're true or false, like a hypothesis. A really good measurement strategy is one that separates measurement from inference. Okay. And this is sort of the core of one of the other articles I gave to you guys, which I think is much more practical and down to earth. It was by Flake and Fried, who are actually, they're psychometricians, they're psychologists. And I signed that article in part because, if you think measurement's bad for political scientists, psychologists have it so much worse, right? And they discussed it a lot, just how people can make these measurement choices, and then those measurement choices, like how do you measure certain like personality concepts and things, has a huge impact on their analysis. Ideally, when we're thinking about measurement, we just want to think about how do we measure this concept, right? What's a really good set of indicators for fast food? Before we talk about the effect of fast food on anything, or what causes fast food, before we get into that, we do our measurement strategy first. Okay, we want to separate these things. Why? Because we really want to avoid selecting a measurement strategy that gets us the answer that we kind of want, or that we think our theory predicts. All right. We want to separate these things ideally. And the best way to separate them is to do your measurement first, right? Figure out what your indicators are, look at them, think about them, present them to audiences. Once you're really satisfied with them, then go and start testing the causal argument. You want to be as open-ended, sort of as inclusive as possible. So, and this is just my measurement approach, use as many proxies as you can, right? As long as you think that those are possible measures of the concept, don't just pick one. If you can, do multiple ones. There are statistical ways for combining them, but also even if you're not doing a statistical thing, you can just look at multiple indicators and see, well, does the relationship hold with this indicator or that indicator? And yes, this article by Flake and Fried talk a lot about what they call questionable measurement practices, right? This is where people essentially aren't very open about why they decide to measure something. And then their inferences, the conclusions they come to, depend on which indicators they pick, right? And I love this statistic they come up with, which is so terrifying, that apparently, based on their review of literature in psychology, there are 280 ways that people measure depression, right? 280 different scales, like basically quizzes that they give people to answer about how they feel. And that's thankfully, I think political science isn't quite that bad, but being open about this stuff is, best way to sort of avoid this. And I won't, walk the whole way through this table, but I do think this is a really great table from their article that, if you just want to be like kind of a set of steps to follow about how you do measurement, how like what are the steps to work through? I think these are great, right? And really thinking, they sound simple, but really, can you define the construct, right? Do you know what it is? Have you thought about how to once you select a measure, an indicator, have you thought about how valid it is and testing that and comparing it to other measures? Doing some thoughts about this is really, really important, because again, a lot of people just jump right into explaining things, right? And they don't want to think about measurement, but really putting in the work pays off down the road. So this is sort of the last part here, and hopefully you guys will engage with this some, but there's this big debate right now in sort of comparative politics. Ellen probably was exposed to some of it at APSA, the American Political Science Association conference last month. There was this big panel, and I love this because it's all about measurement. Everyone was frustrated, and I was just having a great time. And it's basically, so Annie Meng and Andrew Little, two formal theorists, wrote a paper about democratic backsliding, because there is this perception, and I verified this. So I went and Googled democratic backsliding, and sure enough, these are all article titles from magazines and newspapers from the last year. That a lot of people do think that democracy is declining in the world right now. And sometimes the middle one there is sort of an op-ed by a bunch of MPs, and they don't give any evidence for their claims. They just say, we all know democracy is under threat, right? And Andrew Little, Annie Meng said, whoa, not so fast, right? And they use what they call objective indicators. We'll talk about that. And basically say, look, if we look at the number of incumbents, meaning people who are in office, how many of them have lost elections in the last 10, 20, 30 years? That ratio has not changed. People are getting voted out of office just as frequently as they were in 1990 and 2000, right? And so they argue, look, if we use a good indicator for democracy, and some of this, again, comes down to which indicator do we use, but they argue that's like a really core indicator, and we're not seeing that change. And so they think democratic backsliding isn't happening, right? And so this paper got a lot of traction in the media. And they're criticizing a different approach. And this is sort of ugly and big, but I do like using some of the ways that people represent things in the measurement world. So if you notice here, we have three unobserved constructs, okay? And they're all sort of connected. This is a spider's web here. So the one in the bottom is D, which is standing for democracy, okay? And then there's two branches coming out. One goes to O, which for me means objective, and then S, which here means subjective, okay? And then O has, the solid circles mean it's observed. So there are indicators for objective democracy, and then there are indicators for subjective democracy, all right? And what Annie Meng and Andrew Little are arguing is that we should only use the indicators on the left-hand side. We should only use indicators that they argue are objective, meaning we can measure them much more easily. And they use data about elections and turnover rates to make this argument. The people that they're critiquing, which was the other article I gave you guys, is by a group called the Varieties of Democracy Project. And what they do, so their measurement strategy is basically this whole thing. They use indicators that are both objective, so turnover rates, when are elections free and fair, and so-called subjective indicators. And these are where they ask people they call country experts to report on a survey, like using like a 1 to 5 scale or something like that, how democratic the country is. And then they combine all this using a model, which I don't really have time to get into, but and then they produce ultimately, they basically average the objective and subjective indicators together, and then get this one score, democratic score. And their score, their value of democracy has been going down in the past few years, right? So I think this is a really great debate because it sort of exposes some of the difficulties in measurement, right? Because this is essentially a measurement argument. There's nothing causal here. We're not talking about why democracies are backsliding, which Luss actually wrote a report on in the last decade. That's a very, very, very important point. But here we're just saying, which of these is important, right? And what Annie Meng and Andrew Little argue is that part of the reason we don't want to use subjective stuff, they think that the coders are being influenced by the media, that because the media is reporting about democracy and democratic backsliding, we shouldn't trust them because they're seeing threats to democracy that aren't really there. They're just kind of being influenced by people talking about backsliding. And VDEM, their response is essentially, they make an interesting, like part of the response is really interesting, which is you're saying that there are these objective and subjective indicators, and they're basically making the argument everything's sort of subjective. That certain things that you think are really easy to measure, like whether an election is free or fair is actually very difficult. How do you really know if it's free or fair? And autocrats and dictators, they know how to skirt around rules. So like maybe there's they officially turn out as this, but the dictator can, manage to, retain power in some other way that you can't measure, right? And so this argument, basically this is an unresolved argument. So if you go into grad school, and you do comparative politics, you'll hit this again at some point.